In the gilded parlors of Boston's elite, Catherine Montgomery's life of luxury shatters like fine china. Her husband of 15 years, banking magnate Charles Montgomery, announces at their anniversary gala that their marriage was nothing but a calculated business arrangement, now concluded. Cast out with nothing but the dress on her back, she finds herself on a westbound train, tears falling on a one-way ticket to nowhere. The dusty town of Silver Creek seems as good a place as any to disappear. But fate has other plans when local rancher James Cooper spots her silhouette in the setting sun, something about her elegant grace and quiet dignity stirring his soul. Could a woman who once had everything find happiness with a man who has nothing but his heart to give? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rhythmic clatter of train wheels matched the pounding in Catherine's temples as she unfolded the wrinkled society page. Her hands trembled, fine kid gloves discarded days ago, as she forced herself to read the words once more. Montgomery. Marriage revealed as business arrangement. The newspaper had arrived from Boston that morning, carried west by the same rails that bore her toward an uncertain future. Her reflection in the dusty window seemed a stranger's, drawn features, untouched by the usual powder and rouge, hair falling loose from its once perfect coiffure. Was this truly the same woman who had stood in her father's study 19 years ago, barely 20, as he explained the arrangement with all the warmth of discussing a shipping manifest? The Montgomerys need our social connections, Catherine, and we need their financial resources. Charles is a practical choice. Her father had squeezed her shoulder, his touch meant to be comforting, but feeling more like the final turn of a key in a lock. You'll want for nothing. He had been right about that much, at least. For 15 years, she had wanted for nothing, except genuine affection, respect, or the warmth of true companionship. Charles had provided everything money could buy. The finest dresses from Paris, jewels that made other society wives green with envy, a townhouse that rivaled European palaces. Yet he had never once looked at her the way she had seen James Carter look at his wife Sarah across a crowded ballroom, as though she were the only star in his sky. The society pages had called them the perfect couple. Catherine almost laughed. At that now, a bitter sound that drew concerned glances from her fellow passengers. Perfect, yes, perfectly matched in their mutual understanding that their marriage was a merger, nothing more. Or so she had thought. But Charles had broken their unspoken contract in the cruelest way possible. The anniversary gala, their crystal anniversary, 15 years of pristine, polished perfection, had been his stage for the final act of their charade. Catherine closed her eyes, but the scene played out again behind her eyelids with devastating clarity. "My dear friends," Charles had said, champagne glass raised, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to commanding attention. 15 years ago, I made what I considered at the time to be a sound business investment. A ripple of confused murmurs had swept through the crowd. The Montgomery name needed the social cash of the Winters family, and Catherine's father needed an injection of capital to save his shipping empire from ruin. Catherine had stood frozen, her own champagne glass threatening to slip from nerveless fingers as Charles continued, each word a carefully aimed dagger. "That arrangement has served its purpose, but like any wise businessman, I know when to liquidate. An investment that no longer yields returns." He had turned to her then, his smile as cold as a midwinter moon. "Catherine, my dear, consider yourself divested." The newspaper crumpled in her grip. Outside the train window, Boston's familiar coastline had long since given way to endless prairie, each mile of track carrying her further from everything she had ever known. Her reticule, once filled with calling cards and pin money, now held only a handful of dollars, enough for perhaps a week's lodging if she was fortunate. In her trunk, hastily packed by her lady's maid Martha, the only servant who had dared help her after Charles's announcement, lay a single reminder of her former life. A torn society page from 3 years ago, bearing the headline, Montgomery. Banking empire expands west. She had kept it, thinking it might prove useful to know where Charles's business interests lay, so she could avoid those places in her exile. The train whistle pierced the air, startling Catherine from her reverie. The conductor moved through the car, calling out the next stop. Silver Creek Station. 10 minutes. She had chosen it at random when purchasing her ticket, the name holding no meaning beyond its distance from Boston. A small town in the Western Territories. No society columns, no visiting cards, no elaborate gowns or artificial smiles. The thought should have terrified her. Would have terrified the Catherine of 2 weeks ago. But as she gathered her meager belongings, she felt something else stirring beneath the fear and shame. A flicker of possibility, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. She was no longer Catherine Montgomery, society wife and ornament to a banking empire. That woman had died in a Boston ballroom to the tinkling of champagne glasses and the whispers of scandalized guests. Who she would become, that remained. To be seen, Silver Creek Station was little more than a wooden platform extending into the dust. Catherine descended the train steps carefully, her kid boots, already showing signs of wear, landing on sun-bleached boards. The late afternoon, sun cast long shadows across the empty platform, and the wind carried the scent of sage and cattle. Her empty leather purse, once filled with silver and calling cards, now held only loose threads and a hidden compartment containing 3 wrinkled dollar bills. She clutched it anyway, the familiar feel of its handle offering some small comfort. As she surveyed her new surroundings, a single street stretched before her, lined with weather-beaten buildings that seemed to lean into the constant wind. "Station's closing, ma'am," the station master called, already pulling the heavy door shut. "Town's that way." He gestured vaguely down the dusty street before disappearing inside, leaving Catherine alone with her trunk and the settling dust of the departed train. A woman in a sensible calico dress hurried past, pulling her young daughter closer as she caught sight of Catherine's fine, if travel-worn attire. The child stared openly at Catherine's silk skirts, now grey with travel dust, until her mother tugged her away with a sharp whisper, "Don't look at her kind, Sally." Catherine's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin and began the walk into town. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust that settled on her hem, the final insult to what had once been her favorite traveling dress. The trunk's wheels caught and stuttered on the uneven ground, the sound drawing curious glances from the few people still out in the late afternoon heat. The Silver Creek Hotel stood halfway down the main street, its weathered sign promising clean rooms, daily rates. Catherine paused before pushing open the door, gathering what remained of her dignity like a shield. The lobby, such as it was, held only a desk and a few straight-backed chairs, all watched over by a thin woman whose eyes narrowed at Catherine's entrance. "I'd like a room, please," Catherine said, working to keep her voice steady, something modest for a week to start. The woman, Mrs. Tate, according to the name scratched on her desk plate, looked Catherine up and down with undisguised suspicion. "That'll be $2 a night in advance. No gentlemen callers, no noise after 9, and no credit extended to strangers." The word stung, but Catherine merely opened her purse and laid out 2 of her precious dollars. "One night, then," she amended quietly, the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy shawl. She would need to find work, and quickly. Mrs. Tate slid a key across the desk. "Room 3, top of the stairs. Mind you don't track dirt all over my clean floors." The room, when Catherine finally managed to wrestle her trunk up the narrow stairs, was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand beneath a window that overlooked the street. She sank onto the bed, its thin mattress creaking in protest, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. From this vantage point, she could see the town's daily life playing out below. A mother herding children toward home, a man loading supplies into a wagon, 2 women pausing to exchange what was surely the day's gossip. Normal lives lived simply and without pretense. Would she ever find a place among them? The sun was setting when Catherine finally roused herself to wash away the worst of the travel dust. In the small mirror above the washstand, she hardly recognized herself. Gone was the perfectly coiffed society wife, replaced by a woman with tired eyes and untamed hair. She touched her reflection gently, wondering if perhaps this stranger in the mirror might be someone stronger than the woman she'd left behind. In Boston, a movement in the street below caught her eye. A man on horseback had paused at the corner, his broad-brimmed hat shielding his face from the setting sun. Unlike the other townspeople who had hurried past her earlier, he sat quietly, observing. Even from this distance, Catherine could sense something different about him, a stillness, a patience that stood out against the bustling evening activity. For a moment their eyes met through the window glass. He touched the brim of his hat, in a gesture that managed to convey both courtesy and respect, the first she'd received since stepping off the train. Then he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Catherine with an odd sense of having been truly seen for the first time in years. Later, as she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a western night, Catherine found herself thinking of that quiet horseman. There had been no judgment in his gaze, no quick dismissal of her as a fallen society woman, just a simple acknowledgement as one human being to another. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like enough. 5 days had whittled Catherine's resources to a $1 bill and a growing collection of rejected employment inquiries. The general store had no need for help. The schoolhouse already had a teacher. The dress shop closed its curtains. When she approached, her increasingly desperate attempts to find work had only fed the town's whispered speculation about her past. That morning, Mrs. Tate had made it clear that charity was not among her services. "Payments due by sundown," she'd announced loudly enough for the entire breakfast room to hear, "or you'll need to find other accommodations." Now, sitting on a hard bench outside the Mercantile, Catherine pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, trying to stem tears that seemed determined to fall. A shadow fell across her lap, and she looked up to find the horseman from her first evening in town. "Ma'am," he said simply, removing his hat. Up close, she could see that his face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind. "James Cooper, I run the Double C Ranch outside town." Catherine straightened, years of social training asserting themselves despite her circumstances. "Catherine Wynne," she caught herself. "Catherine Montgomery." He nodded, settling beside her on the bench with unhurried movements. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a worn leather Bible, its pages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes in a feminine hand. "My mother kept this Bible," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. "Used to read from it every evening. There's a passage she particularly favored." He opened to a marked page, the spine cracking with familiar ease. "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." Catherine's hands twisted in her lap. "Mr. Cooper, I got an empty barn," he continued as though she hadn't spoken. "Clean, dry. Been using it for storage mostly, but it has a small room up top where my mother used to dry herbs. Needs some work, but it's yours if you want it, in exchange for help around the ranch." The offer hung in the air between them. Catherine could feel the eyes of passing townspeople, could almost hear the accusations their minds were forming. A single woman living at a bachelor's ranch? The scandal would be immediate. James seemed to read her thoughts. He opened the Bible again, this time to a page where a pressed wildflower marked another passage. "My mother took in 3 families. During the drought of '82, he said. Town talked then too. She just kept reading her Bible and doing what she knew was right." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Barn's got a proper door with a lock. Nobody comes up to the ranch without business, and there's plenty of honest work needs doing." He paused, then added softly, "Choice is yours, Mrs. Montgomery. But it seems to me you didn't come all this way to let other folks' opinions rule your life." Catherine looked down at her empty purse, then up at the mercantile's window, where several faces quickly ducked away. Finally, she met James's steady gaze. What sort of work? Cooking, mending, keeping accounts in order. His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Mother always said idle hands make for heavy hearts, plenty of ways to keep hands busy on a ranch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Catherine thought of her narrow room above the hotel, of Mrs. Tate's suspicious glares, of another day of closed doors and turned backs. Then she thought of the quiet respect in James Cooper's eyes when he'd first seen her at the window. "Your mother?" she said carefully. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "Wisest I ever knew." He offered his hand, calloused and strong. "Wagons out front when you're ready." Catherine took his hand and rose, feeling something shift inside her, like a bird long caged spreading its wings. "I'll fetch my trunk." Dawn arrived at the Double C Ranch in shades of lavender and gold, finding Catherine already awake in her barn loft. She had spent the night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and wind whistling. Through the barn boards, her mind alternating between panic at her decision and an unexpected sense of peace. The loft was rustic but sound, with a small window that faced east and sturdy walls, still fragrant with the memory of dried herbs. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook for her clothes were all the furnishings, yet somehow the space felt more like a sanctuary than her elaborate Boston bedroom ever had. Catherine smoothed her skirts, her last good dress, and descended the loft stairs just as James appeared in the barn doorway, carrying something in his hands. "Morning," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "Thought you might need these." He held out a pair of work gloves, the leather soft with age and use. "Were my mother's. She had small hands like yours." Catherine accepted the gloves, running her fingers over the worn leather. Tiny stitches along one palm showed where they'd been carefully mended. "They're too fine to give away." "Not giving them away," James replied. "Putting them back to work, where they belong." He gestured toward the house. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some before we start." The ranch house kitchen was simply furnished, but spotlessly clean. A coffee pot bubbled on the wood stove, and the morning light streamed through curtains that had once been white, but had faded to a soft yellow. James poured 2 cups, adding neither milk nor sugar before setting one before her. "Ranch work starts early," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "Cattle need feeding, eggs need gathering, repairs need making. But first," he took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim, "we need to see about getting you proper work clothes. Can't manage ranch chores in that fine dress." Catherine felt her cheeks warm. "I'm afraid this is all I have." "Well, and this and my traveling suit." James nodded as though he'd expected this. "There's a trunk in the attic, Mother's things. You're welcome to what fits." He met her startled gaze steadily. No use to anyone gathering dust. An hour later, Catherine stood before the small mirror in her loft, hardly recognizing herself. The simple cotton dress was a few years out of fashion and had needed taking in at the waist, but the skirt's practical length and sturdy fabric were better suited to ranch work than anything she'd owned in years. Her hair, simply braided and pinned up, felt strange without its usual elaborate styling. She pulled on the work gloves, flexing her fingers in the well-worn leather. Through the window, she could see James in the yard below, already at work. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and descended the stairs. The morning passed in a blur of new experiences. James showed her how to scatter feed for the chickens, demonstrating the right way to move so the birds wouldn't swarm around her feet. He taught her to check for eggs, his hands steady, as he showed her how to reach under a sitting hen without getting pecked. "Never collected eggs before?" he asked when she emerged triumphant with her first warm egg. "Never even seen a live chicken?" "Before last week," Catherine admitted, then found herself laughing at the absurdity of it all. After a moment, James joined in, his deep chuckle harmonizing with her softer laughter. By mid-morning, her back ached from unfamiliar work, and her gloves bore fresh scuff marks from learning to operate the water pump. Yet with each new task mastered, Catherine felt something shifting inside her. Pride, perhaps, or the satisfaction of useful work. "Time to check the garden," James announced as the sun climbed higher. He led her to a plot behind the house where neat rows of vegetables grew between patches of weeds. "Mother always said a ranch needs fresh vegetables as much as it needs cattle." Catherine knelt in the soft earth, remembering the elaborate conservatory gardens she'd once supervised in Boston. This was different, not flowers for show, but food for sustenance. She pulled on her gloves and reached for the first weed. "You're taking to it well," James observed quietly. Catherine looked up at him, squinting against the sun. "The garden?" "All of it." He gestured to her gloved hands, already dirty from honest work. "Most society ladies wouldn't have made it past breakfast." "I'm not most society ladies," Catherine replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Not anymore," James nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "No," he agreed, "I don't suppose you are." After a week of dawn rising and honest labor, Catherine sat at James's kitchen table, watching as he spread a weathered piece of parchment before her. His rough hands smoothed the creases with surprising gentleness, revealing a hand-drawn map of the Double C Ranch. "Made this with Mother years ago," he explained, his finger tracing the careful lines. "Each spring we'd update it, marking new fences, water sources, good grazing spots." The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair as he leaned forward. "Thought it might help you get your bearings." Catherine studied the map, noting the precise details. Creek beds marked in blue ink, pasture boundaries outlined in careful strokes, small symbols indicating different types of terrain. In one corner, a feminine hand had written, "Remember, the land speaks to those who listen." "Your mother was quite the cartographer," she observed, touching the delicate compass rose in one corner. "She said knowing your land was like knowing your own heart." James's voice carried a warmth she'd not heard before. "Every valley, every rise, every place the wind changes direction. It all matters." That afternoon, James saddled 2 horses, his own bay gelding and a gentle mare named Star for Catherine. "Time you saw the whole spread," he said, offering his hand to help her mount. Catherine gathered her borrowed skirts and settled into the saddle, grateful for the riding lessons of her youth. They rode first to the north pasture, where cattle grazed in the late summer heat. James explained how to read the animals' behavior, the way they clustered near water when storms approached, how their movements showed where the grass was sweetest. "See that old oak?" He pointed to a massive tree standing alone on a rise. "That's the north boundary. Beyond that is Whitman's spread, good neighbor, fair man." He turned in his saddle to gauge her interest. "Important to know your neighbors out here." Catherine nodded, remembering the elaborate social geography of Boston society. This was different, simpler, but no less vital. "And to the east?" she asked, already studying the landscape with new eyes. "Creek runs the property line there, deeper than it looks, good fishing in spring." He led them along a ridge, pointing out landmarks. "Lightning struck that pine 3 summers back. Use it as a marker for the east pasture gate." The afternoon unfolded in a lesson of land and life. James showed her where the best blackberries grew wild, which draws held water even in drought, which slopes shed snow first in winter. Catherine found herself mapping it all in her mind, not just the physical features, but the stories behind them. "That collapsed barn?" she asked, pointing to a weathered structure. "Why hasn't it been cleared?" A small smile touched James's lips. "Barns, swallows nest there every spring. Mother said they had as much right to it as we did." He paused, then added quietly, "Some things are worth more standing broken than torn down." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond fallen barns. Catherine felt them settle in her heart, next to other truths she was slowly learning about worth and value and the difference between broken and ruined. They stopped to rest the horses near a spring, its clear water bubbling up between rocks worn smooth by time. James produced a simple lunch of bread and cheese from his saddlebag, offering her share wrapped in a clean handkerchief. "When I first came to the ranch," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I was 12. Father had just died, and Mother brought us here to start fresh. Felt big and wild and impossible then." He looked out over the rolling land. "Took time to learn its ways, its rhythms. But once you do," he trailed off. But Catherine understood. "It becomes part of you," she finished softly. He met her eyes, something like surprise and approval mingling in his gaze. That evening, after returning to the barn, Catherine found the map waiting on her loft bed, along with a pencil and James's mother's journal of ranch notes. His unspoken invitation was clear. This knowledge was now hers to continue, to build upon. She sat by lamplight, adding her own careful observations to the map's margins. The sweet grass patch near the creek, the rocky outcrop where wildflowers bloomed, the way the evening sun turned the west pasture to gold. Small details, perhaps, but like stitches in a treasured quilt, each one helped bind her more firmly to this new life she was creating. Sunday morning found Catherine standing before the white-painted church, clutching her borrowed hymnal. The past weeks of ranch work had changed her. Her hands were tougher, her complexion sun-kissed, her carriage more natural. She wore one of Mrs. Cooper's renovated dresses, simple but clean, her hair neatly braided without ornament. James stood beside her, his Sunday best showing signs of careful pressing. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her heart raced as they approached the church steps. The whispers began before they reached the door. Mrs. Tate's voice carried clearly. "Living in sin, if you ask me. That poor Cooper boy, bewitched by a city woman's ways." The church bulletin board beside the entrance displayed the week's announcements. Catherine's eyes caught on a notice about the Ladies' Aid Society meeting. "Respectable women welcome." The implications were clear as crystal. Inside, the congregation parted like water around stones, leaving empty pews to either side of them. James led them to his family's traditional spot, third row from the back, his hand hovering near her elbow, with quiet support. Reverend Matthews's sermon focused on the prodigal son, his eyes seeming to find Catherine with uncomfortable frequency. When the collection plate passed, several hands deliberately stretched across the empty space to avoid touching her side of the pew. "Quite a show of Christian charity," James murmured, just loud enough for nearby ears. His voice carried no anger, only a calm observation that somehow made the whispers more shameful than outrage would have. After the service, Catherine started toward the door, but James guided her toward the church's small garden instead. They sat on a weathered bench while the congregation filed past, some openly staring, others studiously avoiding their gaze. "My mother planted these roses," James said conversationally, as though they weren't the center of scandal. "Town ladies said wild roses weren't proper for a church garden. She planted them anyway. Said God made wild roses same as garden ones." Catherine watched a butterfly land on one of the untamed blooms. "Your mother sounds like she was quite remarkable. She understood something most folks forget." He turned to face her directly. "Worth isn't in what others say about you. It's in what you do, how you face each day, whether you choose kindness, when it'd be easier not to." The church door opened, and Reverend Matthews approached, holding a fresh bulletin. "Mrs. Montgomery," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "we missed you at last week's services." "Catherine was helping deliver a calf," James replied before she could speak. "Took all Saturday night and Sunday morning. Figured God might understand, seeing as he created both Sabbath and cattle." The minister shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, perhaps Mrs. Montgomery would be more comfortable attending services in Silver City. It's only 20 miles. "My mother's roses are blooming nice this year, Reverend," James interrupted mildly. "Remind me, didn't she plant them the same year the church roof needed replacing? Seemed to recall she sold quite a few bouquets to help raise the funds." A flush crept up the minister's neck. "Your mother was a godly woman, James." "She was. Taught me a lot about judgment, too. Not the human kind, the other sort. James stood, offering Catherine his arm. "Good day, Reverend, we've got chores waiting." As they walked toward the wagon, Catherine felt the weight of stairs on her back, but James's arm was steady under her hand and the morning sun warm on her face. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'm making things difficult for you here." James helped her into the wagon before responding. "Town's got a short memory when it comes to their own history. Half these folks came here running from something, debt, scandal, broken dreams. Give them time, they'll remember." They drove home in comfortable silence, the church bulletin lying forgotten in the wagon bed. Catherine found herself thinking of wild roses blooming against church walls, of strength that looked like gentleness, and of a different kind of Sunday worship, one found in honest work and quiet kindness. That evening, as she added fresh flowers to the jam jar on her loft windowsill, Catherine realized she was humming one of the morning's hymns. Perhaps, she thought, there were many ways to praise creation's mysteries. Some involved church pews and judgment. Others simply required an open heart and willing hands. The morning sky brooded purple-black over the Double C Ranch, and the wind carried the sharp scent of approaching rain. Catherine stood at the fence line, her hands resting on a weathered post that had stood sentinel since James's father's time. Its wood was silver with age, scarred by wind and weather, yet it held firm against her weight. "Storm's coming," James said, appearing beside her. His eyes scanned the horizon with the focused attention of a man who knew nature's moods. "Bad, by the look of those clouds." Catherine felt the electricity in the air, saw how the cattle clustered nervously in the lower meadow. In her 2 months at the ranch, she'd learned to read these signs, to feel the rhythm of the land in her bones. "The creek might flood," she said, remembering the ranch map's markings. "Aye." James tested the fence post, his calloused hands running over its worn surface. "We need to move the herd to higher ground and check all the fence lines. Can't afford to lose any stock if they spook." They worked quickly, moving from post to post along the fence line. Catherine had learned to spot weak points, to test the wire's tension. Her gloved hands, once soft with privilege, now moved with confident purpose. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as they reached the far pasture. Wind whipped Catherine's skirts around her legs, and thunder rolled overhead like distant artillery. The cattle were growing restless, their low bellows carrying on the wind. "We need to move them now," James called over the rising storm. He swung onto his horse, then reached down to help Catherine mount behind him. There was no time for propriety. The gelding could move faster with both of them than they could manage with 2 horses in the storm. Catherine wrapped her arms around James's waist as they rode toward the herd. His body was solid and warm against hers, steadying her as the horse picked its way across the increasingly treacherous ground. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark white flashes. They worked in wordless harmony, guiding the nervous cattle toward higher ground. Catherine had learned to project calm authority in her voice, calling out to the stragglers just as James had taught her. The rain fell in sheets now, plastering her clothes to her skin, but she barely noticed. A massive crack of thunder sent the herd surging forward. In the chaos, Catherine spotted a calf separated from its mother, dangerously close to the creek's swelling banks. Without thinking, she slipped from behind James and ran toward the frightened animal. "Catherine!" James's voice carried sharp with concern, but she was already moving, her boots sliding in the mud. The calf bawled in terror as another lightning bolt illuminated the scene. She reached the animal just as the creek bank began to crumble. Strong hands grabbed her waist, pulling her and the calf back from the edge. James had dismounted and followed, his presence solid as the old fence post behind her. They stood together in the rain, the rescued calf between them, their breath coming in quick bursts. Lightning flashed again, and Catherine saw something in James's eyes that made her heart skip. Fear for her safety, yes, but something else. Too, something that made the storm's electricity feel mild in comparison. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said, his hands still at her waist. Sometimes they're the same thing, she replied, remembering another kind of leap she'd taken when she'd first agreed to stay at his ranch. The moment stretched between them, taut as fence wire. Then the calf bumped against their legs, breaking the spell, and they returned to the task at hand. Together they guided the herd to safety, working through the worst of the storm until every animal was accounted for. Hours later, soaked and mud-splattered, they sat on James's porch, watching. The storm's fury spent itself against the mountains. Catherine wrapped her hands around a cup of hot coffee, feeling the ache in muscles that had grown strong with honest work. "That old fence post," she said suddenly, remembering how solid it had felt under her hands that morning. "It's been through countless storms, hasn't it?" James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Storm-tested things," he said quietly. "They don't break easy, get stronger sometimes for having weathered what comes." Catherine felt the truth of his words settle in her heart, alongside other lessons she'd learned about strength and survival, and the different ways people could weather life's storms. She thought of herself just months ago, breaking apart in a Boston ballroom, and marveled at how far she'd come. "Thank you," she said softly, "for teaching me about fence posts and storms." His hand found hers in the gathering dusk, work roughened, fingers closing gently over her own. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain and the quiet certainty growing between them. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carried by young Tommy Wilson from the telegraph office in town. Catherine was in the garden, dirt streaking her apron as she harvested late summer tomatoes, when she heard the boy's horse approaching. "Message for the Double C Ranch," Tommy called out, waving the yellow paper. "Ma said to deliver it straight away, on account of it being marked urgent." James emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. He accepted the telegram, pressing a coin into Tommy's eager palm. Catherine watched his face as he read, noting how his jaw tightened almost. "Imperceptibly. Thank you, Tommy," he said evenly. "Tell your ma the fence mending's done, whenever she's ready to bring those sheep over." Only after the boy had ridden away did James turn to Catherine. Without a word, he held out the telegram. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it, the yellow paper somehow feeling heavier than it should. "Seeking information on whereabouts of Catherine Montgomery. Stop substantial reward. Offered stop contact. Charles Montgomery at Boston National Bank. Stop discretion assured. Stop." The careful rows of vegetables blurred before her eyes. She'd known this moment might come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon. But the reality of seeing Charles's name printed in stark telegraph type made her stomach clench. "He's looking for me," she said softly, stating the obvious to fill the sudden silence. James took the telegram back, studying it as though the brief message might reveal new meanings. "Question is why," he said finally. "Man doesn't publicly discard something, then send search parties after it." Catherine sank onto the garden bench, her mother-in-law's favorite spot for watching sunsets. "Charles never does anything without a reason," she said. "Every move is calculated, every action planned for maximum effect. Like the anniversary party?" James's voice was gentle, but she heard the underlying steel. "Exactly like that." Catherine plucked a leaf from her skirt, shredding it between her fingers. "He must need something. My signature, perhaps, or my public support for some business venture." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was always good at playing the devoted wife at shareholders' meetings." James settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, solid and reassuring. "You don't have to be found," he said quietly. "Silver Creek's a small town, but folks here know how to keep their own counsel when it matters. Even the ones who think I'm a scandal waiting to happen. Especially them." The corners of his mouth lifted slightly. "Town's got no love for fancy Eastern bankers coming around asking questions." Catherine looked down at her dirt-stained hands, so different from the manicured fingers that had once poured tea at Boston's finest social gatherings. "I'm not afraid of Charles," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Not anymore. I'm afraid of—" She hesitated, searching for words. "Losing this. James finished for her. His hand covered hers, work-roughened palm against her newly calloused fingers. The ranch. The life you're building. Yes, the word came out barely above a whisper. I never knew who I was in Boston. Charles's wife, Edmund Winter's daughter, the perfect society hostess, they were all just roles I played. Here, she gestured to the garden, the barn, the endless sky above them. Here, I'm just Catherine, and for the first time, that feels like enough. James was quiet for a long moment, the telegram forgotten on the bench between them. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the same steady certainty he used to calm spooked horses. My mother used to say that some things, once broken, can't be put back the way they were. He turned to face her fully, but that doesn't mean they can't be rebuilt into something stronger. Catherine felt the weight of his words, the deeper meaning beneath them. Your mother seems to have had wisdom for every situation. She'd have liked you, he said simply. Would have appreciated how you face things head-on, how you're not afraid of honest work or hard truths. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Catherine watched the telegram flutter in the evening. Breeze. Charles's threat printed in fading ink. What should we do with it? James stood, offering her his hand. Light the stove for supper, he said. Paper burns just fine. She took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. Together they walked toward the house, leaving the telegram behind. Later, Catherine would watch it curl and blacken in the stove's flames, feeling not triumph or fear, but a quiet certainty that whatever Charles was planning, she was no longer the same woman he had cast aside. The leather-bound ledger lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with James's careful but basic accounting. Catherine ran her finger down columns of numbers, pausing at entries that caught her eye. After 3 months on the ranch, she'd learned to read more than just the land. She could read the story of the Double C's struggles and triumphs, written in ink and arithmetic. Your cattle prices are too low, she said, looking up at James as he poured them both coffee, especially compared to the cost of feed and labor. He settled into the chair across from her, the morning sun catching the silver at his temples. Been selling to the same buyers for years. They're fair men who know you'll accept their first offer. Catherine pulled out a sheet of paper where she'd been making calculations. I've been comparing your ledger to the market reports in the Silver City newspaper. You're leaving money on the table, James. He studied her notes, respect evident in his expression. Didn't know. You were watching the markets. Charles may have treated me like a decorative vase, but I learned things at those endless business dinners. She allowed herself a small smile. Amazing what men will say when they think a woman is only interested in tea and gossip. James leaned back, cradling his coffee cup. Always figured Mother's way of running things was good enough, simple, straightforward. It was, Catherine assured him quickly. But times are changing. The railroad's pushing west, new markets are opening up. The Double C could do more than just survive, it could thrive. She turned the ledger, pointing to specific entries. See here, you're buying feed at summer prices when you could contract for winter delivery at better rates. And these repair costs, if you bought materials in bulk with other ranchers, you could all save money. A thoughtful look crossed James's face. Thompson's spread and Wilson's place both need the same supplies we do. Exactly. Catherine warmed to her subject, drawing on years of observation at Charles's business meetings. And when it comes to selling, if you coordinated your cattle drives with theirs, you'd have more bargaining power with the buyers. They couldn't, and play one ranch against another. James studied her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. You've given this a lot of thought. I want to contribute, she said softly, not just with physical labor, but with whatever knowledge I have. The ranch has given me so much, a home, purpose, a chance to be more than just someone's wife. She caught herself adding quickly, not that being a wife is, I know what you mean. His hand covered hers where it rested on the ledger. And you're right, about all of it. He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. Though, I suspect some of those cattle buyers won't take kindly to getting outmaneuvered by a woman. Catherine felt a spark of her old confidence return. Then perhaps they shouldn't have underestimated us in the first place. Over the next few hours, they pored over the books together. Catherine showed him how to track market trends, calculate optimal selling times, and project future expenses. James contributed his deep knowledge of ranching cycles and local conditions, their different expertise blending into something stronger than either alone. My father always said a man should run his ranch like his father before him, James mused as the afternoon light began to fade. But maybe there's wisdom in new ways too. Catherine closed the ledger gently. Your mother planted wild roses at the church, she reminded him. Sometimes the old ways and the new can grow together, make something better than either alone. He looked at her then, with an expression that made her heart skip. You've brought more than just business sense to the Double C, Catherine. And the Double C has given me more than just shelter, she replied, holding his gaze. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. The evening sun slanted through the windows, turning the kitchen golden. Catherine's fingers traced the worn cover of the ledger, thinking of how symbols of commerce, accounts, and telegrams and business contracts had once represented her cage. Now, here in this sunlit kitchen, they had become tools of her liberation. Tomorrow, she said, we should ride over to Thompson's ranch, talk to him about bulk supplies. James nodded, rising to light the lamps as dusk settled in. Tomorrow, he agreed, and in his voice she heard not just acceptance of her business proposal, but something more, a shared vision of all their tomorrows, built on respect and understanding. And the quiet joy of working side by side, August arrived with merciless heat, the kind that shimmered above the prairie grass and turned the horizon liquid. Catherine and James worked the fence line together, replacing posts damaged by summer storms. The old tin canteen passed between them like a ritual, their fingers brushing with each exchange. Catherine had long since abandoned any pretense of propriety in the heat. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her mother-in-law's old work dress damp with honest sweat. She watched James drive another post into the unforgiving ground, the muscles in his forearms flexing with each strike of the hammer. When he paused to wipe his brow, she held out the canteen. Your mother would be scandalized, she said, a smile playing at her lips as he drank, seeing her fine dress put to such use. James lowered the canteen, watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Think she'd be more scandalized by how well you wear it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Catherine felt her cheeks warm, and not from the sun. These moments had been coming more frequently. Quiet observations, lingering glances, the electricity of almost touching as they worked side by side. We should finish this section before noon, she said, turning back to her task of threading wire between the posts. But she could feel his eyes on her, the way she'd grown aware of his presence like a second heartbeat. They worked in comfortable silence, moving with the easy rhythm of people accustomed to each other's patterns. Catherine had learned to anticipate when James would need the wire pulled taut, when to brace the post as he hammered. He, in turn, seemed to know exactly when to offer his hand over rough ground, or his strength with a particularly stubborn knot. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and still. Catherine reached for the canteen again, but found it empty. I'll refill it at the creek, she offered, grateful for an excuse to cool off. I'll come with you, James said quickly. Best not to walk alone with those summer rattlers about. The creek ran cool and clear through a stand of cottonwoods, their shade a blessed relief. Catherine knelt at the water's edge, submerging the canteen. James settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You've changed, he said quietly, watching the play of sunlight on water. Catherine glanced at him, reading the deeper question in his expression. For the better, I hope. You were fine china before, he said, choosing his words carefully. Beautiful, but kept behind glass. Now you're... He paused, searching for the right comparison. Wild roses, she offered, remembering his mother's. Church garden. His smile was sudden and warm. Exactly that. Growing stronger in open air, thorns and all. Catherine capped the canteen, but didn't rise, savoring the moment of peace. When I first came here, I thought I was running away, from Charles, from scandal, from everything I'd known. She traced patterns in the damp earth beside her, but maybe I was running towards something instead. James's hand covered hers, stilling her restless fingers. And what do you think you were running toward? She looked up then, meeting his gaze directly. The question demanded honesty, and these past months had taught her the value of hard truths. Life, she said simply. Real life, with dirt under my nails and sweat on my brow, and she hesitated, then finished softly, and someone who sees me. Not just the person I was supposed to be. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, the calluses on his hand catching against her own work-roughened skin. The touch sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "Catherine," he began, his voice rough with emotion. A meadowlark's sudden call broke the moment. Catherine pulled her hand away reluctantly, rising with the canteen. "We should finish the fence," she said, but her voice betrayed her, trembling slightly on the words. James stood too, closer than strictly necessary. "Fence has waited this long," he said softly. "Could wait a bit longer." But Catherine was already moving back toward their work, her heart pounding. She wasn't ready, not quite yet, for what she saw in his eyes. The wounds from Charles were still healing, and James was too important to risk with haste. Yet as they returned to their tasks, sharing the water and the work and the comfortable silence, Catherine felt something settling into place inside her, like a fence post driven deep into solid ground. Some things, once properly founded, could weather any storm. September painted the Double C Ranch in autumn gold, setting the cottonwoods aflame with color and turning the prairie grass to bronze. Catherine stood at her loft window, pressing the last wildflowers of summer between the pages of Mrs. Cooper's old Bible. Each bloom held a memory. Purple asters from the creek bank where they'd shared lunch, golden black-eyed Susans from the fence line, delicate prairie roses that reminded her of dawn. Preserving memories. James's voice carried up from below. She looked down to find him watching her, his expression soft in the autumn light. "Your mother pressed flowers in her Bible," Catherine said, making her way down the barn stairs. "I found them when I was reading it last night. Little pieces of beauty, saved between verses about hope and redemption." He met her at the bottom of the stairs, close enough that she could smell hay and leather and the crisp scent of approaching winter on his clothes. "Found something similar in the ledger yesterday," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Thought you might want to add it to your collection." He held out a perfect Indian paintbrush, its vibrant red barely faded. Catherine recognized it immediately. They'd found a patch blooming late near the north fence 2 weeks ago. A splash of summer's last defiance against the coming cold. "You saved it," she said softly, accepting the flower. Their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away. "Reminded me of you," he replied, his voice low, "strong enough to bloom even when the season's turning." Catherine looked up at him, her heart suddenly racing. They'd been dancing around this moment for weeks, drawing closer with each shared task, each quiet conversation, each brush of hands over work-worn tools. "James," she began, but he shook his head gently. "Need to show you something first," he said. "Wear your warm shawl. Morning's got a bite to it." They rode double on his horse, Catherine's arms wrapped around his waist as they climbed the hill. Behind the ranch house, the sunrise painted the world in watercolor shades of pink and gold, and their breath fogged in the crisp air. At the crest of the hill, James helped her dismount. Below them stretched the Double C, its fence lines and buildings laid out like a map come to life. But it was different now from the ranch she'd first seen 5 months ago. The barn roof gleamed, with new shingles they'd laid together. The garden showed neat rows of winter vegetables, planted according to her calculations for spring income. Even the cattle in the lower pasture were more numerous, thanks to her suggested breeding program. "Look there," James said, pointing to where Thompson's ranch bordered their land. "He's implementing those bulk supply protocols you designed. Wilson's place too." His voice carried quiet pride. "You've changed more than just the double C, Catherine. You've changed how people think about running their ranches." She turned to face him, struck by the morning light catching in his hair, the warmth in his eyes. "The ranch changed me first," she said. "Showed me who I could be when I stopped living behind glass." "And who is that?" he asked softly. Catherine touched the dried paintbrush flower in her pocket, thinking of all the precious moments she'd preserved between Bible pages. "Someone who knows the value of real things," she said. "Hard work, honest words, true feelings." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Someone who's learned that love isn't a business arrangement or a social contract. It's this." She gestured to the ranch below, to the life they'd been building together. James moved closer, his hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "And what exactly is this?" he asked, though his eyes said he already knew. "Partnership," she whispered. "Trust. The way you teach me things without making me feel small for not knowing them. The way you listen when I have ideas, even if they're different from how things have always been done." His thumb traced her cheekbone, gentle as morning light. "Anything else?" Catherine smiled, feeling the last walls around her heart crumble like autumn leaves. "The way you look at me," she said softly, "like I'm more precious than any flower pressed between pages." They were so close now she could feel the warmth of him, solid and real against the morning chill. Around them, the wind whispered through prairie grass, and somewhere a meadowlark called to its mate. "Catherine," he murmured, his voice rough, with emotion. "May I?" "Yes," she breathed. And then his lips were on hers, tasting of coffee and autumn air, and promises kept. She melted into him, feeling his arms come around her, strong and sure as the land itself. When they finally parted, the sun had fully risen, painting the world in shades of possibility. Catherine touched her lips, smiling at the wonder of it. 5 months ago, she'd arrived with nothing but a broken heart and an empty purse. Now she held a future in her hands, as precious and real as the dried flowers she preserved, a reminder that beauty, like love, could bloom in the most unexpected places. Winter descended on the Double C Ranch, with teeth of ice and breath of snow, transforming the familiar landscape into something wild and white. Catherine stood at the barn door, watching James check the cattle through swirling flakes, a patched quilt wrapped around her shoulders. The quilt had been his mother's work, every square telling a story, every careful stitch speaking of love and preparation for harsh seasons. The morning had dawned bitter cold, their breath freezing in the air as they'd done chores. Now, as afternoons settled into a steel-grey twilight, the temperature continued to drop. The wind carried the promise of what old-timers called a blue norther, the kind of storm that tested both structures and souls. "Storm's coming in faster than expected," James said, stamping snow from his boots as he entered the barn. His face was red with cold, his beard frosted. "Cattle are settled in the sheltered valley, but—" He paused, studying her face. "You're worried about something." Catherine smiled, still marveling at how well he'd learned to read her. "The roof repair on the west side of the barn. Will it hold?" He moved closer, adjusting the quilt around her shoulders. His hands lingered there, warm despite the cold. "We did good work on those patches, but maybe we should move your things down from the loft, just to be safe." They'd been dancing around this subject since their first kiss 2 weeks ago. The proper thing would be for Catherine to take a room in town during the worst of winter. The practical thing, and the thing both their hearts whispered, was something else entirely. "I could sleep in the ranch house," she said carefully, "on the settle in the kitchen near the stove." James's hands stilled on her shoulders. "Or," he said, his voice equally measured, "you could take my room. I'll sleep in the kitchen." Catherine turned to face him, keeping the quilt wrapped around them both, creating a warm space in the midst of winter. "James Cooper," she said softly. "Are you trying to be noble or practical?" "Trying to be respectful," he answered, but his arms slid around her waist, drawing her closer. "Of your reputation, of your choices." "My reputation?" She laughed quietly. "The town already thinks the worst. And as for my choices—" She lifted her hand to his cheek, feeling the rough warmth of his beard against her palm. "I choose this. Us. A partnership in all things." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her. Work-roughened fingers. "You're sure?" "There's no going back from this, Catherine. Once the town knows you're living in the house, I've never been more sure of anything." She thought of the careful stitches in the quilt around their shoulders, how his mother had pieced together warmth and beauty from fragments of cloth. Sometimes broken pieces come together to make something stronger. The wind rose outside, rattling the barn doors, but in their shared warmth, winter seemed distant. James's kiss, when it came, tasted of snow and coffee and certainty. Catherine melted into him, feeling the last pieces of her old life fall away like autumn leaves. Later, they moved her trunk into the ranch house together. The kitchen glowed, warm and golden in the early evening light, the wood stove crackling with promise. Catherine hung the quilt on a peg by the door, no longer just a cover against cold, but a symbol of two lives being stitched together. That night, as the storm raged outside, they sat at the kitchen table planning spring plantings. The familiar ledger lay open between them, but now their hands met openly over the pages, fingers intertwining as they talked of futures and possibilities. "We should expand the garden," Catherine said, sketching plans in the margin. "With the railroad coming through Silver City next year, fresh vegetables will fetch good prices." "Thompson's wife was asking about your preserved fruit," James added. "Could be another source of income." They worked together as the evening deepened, their shadows dancing on the walls in the lamplight. The storm's fury only emphasized the warmth within, the coffee pot bubbling on the stove, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the comfortable silences that fell between words. When James finally rose to bank the fire for the night, he paused behind her chair, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Welcome home," he said softly, and in those two words, Catherine heard everything they'd been building toward since that first day she'd stepped off the train. She covered his hands with hers, feeling the strength in them, the promise. Outside, winter howled its challenges, but inside, they had built something warm and real and lasting, as sturdy as a well-made quilt, as beautiful as wild roses blooming against church walls, as true as love freely chosen. The calling card arrived first. Cream-colored vellum delivered by a nervous-looking Tommy Wilson. "Fine gentleman at the hotel asked me to bring this out," the boy said, holding the card like it might bite. "Paid me a whole silver dollar." Catherine stood in the ranch house doorway, staring at the elegant copperplate script, "Charles Montgomery, Boston National Bank." The card's weight in her hand seemed to grow with each passing second, as if all the years of her previous life were pressed into that small rectangle of paper. James appeared behind her, one hand settling warm and steady on her shoulder. "Tommy," he said calmly, "ride back and tell Mr. Montgomery we'll receive him at 2:00. After the boy galloped away, James turned Catherine gently to face him. "Whatever he wants, we'll face it together." She pressed her face against his chest for a moment, drawing strength from his solid presence. "He never does anything without a reason," she murmured, "and he never accepts defeat. Good thing neither do you anymore." Charles arrived precisely at 2, driving a rented carriage that looked absurdly out of place on the ranch's rutted drive. He stepped down with the same elegant efficiency Catherine remembered, his Eastern suit and polished boots untouched by the prairie dust. "My dear Catherine," he called, as though they were meeting at a Boston social function. "How rustic you've become." Catherine felt James tense beside her on the porch, but she squeezed his hand reassuringly. She was no longer the woman who had fled Boston in shame. "Charles," she replied evenly, "you're a long way from your counting house. Business requires attention to detail." Charles mounted the porch steps, managing to look down his nose despite Catherine and James's elevated position. Even his gaze swept over James with calculated dismissal. In such remote locations. "State your business, Mr. Montgomery," James said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used with spooked horses. Charles pulled another calling card from his vest pocket, but this one was different. Printed on the back was a series of numbers. "The Montgomery Bank is expanding westward," he said, extending the card to Catherine. "Several prominent investors have expressed concern about my personal situation. An untidy marriage dissolution creates uncertainty, you see." Catherine didn't take the card. And, Charles continued smoothly, "it would be most convenient if you were to return to Boston. Briefly. Sign some papers. Make a few public appearances to show there's no animosity. The bank would naturally compensate you quite generously." "You want me to help you save face," Catherine said, the reality clicking into place. "To prove you didn't discard me like a worn-out glove at our anniversary party. I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial business arrangement." Charles's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unless you've grown fond of mucking out stables." James took a step forward, but Catherine laid a hand on his arm. "Actually, Charles," she said, surprised at how steady her voice was, "I have grown fond of it, of all of it. The honest work, the clean air, the simple truths." She met his gaze directly. "Things you wouldn't understand." "Don't be absurd, Catherine. This is no life for a woman of your breeding. Look at yourself. Worn clothes, calloused hands, living in sin with a common rancher." "Living in love," she corrected quietly, "with a good man. And yes, look at me, Charles. Really look. I'm stronger than I've ever been. Happier than you ever allowed me to be. My hands aren't just calloused. They're capable. They can mend fences, tend gardens, keep books, and hold on tight to what matters." Charles's facade cracked slightly, showing a flash of genuine anger. "You're my wife." "No," Catherine said, "I'm not. You made that perfectly clear at the anniversary party. You can't discard something and then demand its return when convenient. The bank will have to find another way to reassure its investors." She stepped forward, James a solid presence at her back. "You taught me about business, Charles, about contracts and negotiations and cutting losses. Consider this a completed transaction." "You'll regret this," Charles said, his voice cold, "when winter comes and your romantic notions freeze along with your precious garden. When you realize what you've given up for this primitive existence." Catherine smiled, thinking of warm kitchen evenings and shared ledgers, of quilts patched with love, and wild roses blooming against all odds. "The only thing I regret," she said softly, "is not realizing sooner that real wealth isn't counted in bank ledgers." Charles stood very still, and for a moment Catherine saw something like genuine bewilderment cross his face. This wasn't the society wife he'd married, trained to bend to his will. This was someone else entirely, someone he'd never truly known. "Good day, Mr. Montgomery," James said quietly. "I trust you can find your way back to town." Charles looked between them once more, then turned on his heel and descended the steps. Catherine watched him drive away, the elegant carriage raising dust on the ranch road. When he was out of sight, she picked up the calling card he'd left behind and tore it neatly in two. "Well," she said, letting the pieces flutter away on the prairie wind, "I believe we have a garden to tend." The property deed lay on Reverend Matthews's desk, its official seals and elaborate script a stark contrast to the simple furnishings of his study. Charles stood by the window, while James and Catherine sat side by side on the hard wooden chairs reserved for pastoral counseling. $10,000, Charles said, his voice carrying the smooth assurance of a man accustomed to buying whatever he desired. "Well above market value for a ranch this size. The deed would transfer to the bank immediately, of course, but you'd be allowed to remain as tenant farmers through the winter." Catherine felt James's hand tighten around hers. The offer was enormous, more money than the Double C would earn in 5 good years. She knew the calculations intimately now, had spent enough evenings over the ledgers to understand exactly what Charles was offering. "And if we refuse?" James's voice was quiet but firm. Charles turned from the window, sunlight gleaming off, his gold watch chain. "The railroad's coming, Mr. Cooper. New routes being planned, new stations needed. It would be unfortunate if the main line were to bypass Silver Creek entirely. Small towns wither quickly without rail access." "You're threatening the whole town," Catherine said, the familiar cold calculation in Charles's tone making her skin crawl. "All because I won't play my part in your banking expansion? I prefer to think of it as leveraging available resources." Charles smiled thinly. "The Montgomery Bank carries considerable influence with the Railroad Commission. One good word from me about the advantages of a Silver Creek station." Reverend Matthews shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The minister had insisted on hosting this meeting, perhaps hoping to prevent violence, or possibly seeking to protect Catherine's reputation. Now he looked like a man regretting his hospitality. "The deed's been in the Cooper family for 3 generations, James said. "This land was worked by my grandfather, my father, my mother. Their lives are written in every fence post and field." "Sentiment," Charles dismissed. "Hardly a sound business principle. Catherine understands this, or she did before her." "Rustic transformation." He moved to the desk, spreading crisp banknotes beside the deed. "Think of what you could do with this money, Mr. Cooper. Buy a larger spread elsewhere, modernize your operation, give Catherine the life she deserves." Catherine stood, her movement so sudden both men turned to stare. "The life I deserve." She walked to the deed, running her fingers over the familiar names. "I had that life, Charles. Silk dresses and society parties and a marriage as empty as a corporate ledger." She picked up the deed, feeling the weight of its history. This paper isn't just a legal document, it's a record of love and labor. Every signature here represents someone who worked this land, who understood its worth couldn't be measured in dollars. "Poetic," Charles said dryly, "but hardly practical. The railroad—" "Will find Silver Creek a thriving community," Catherine interrupted. "One with 3 successful ranches implementing innovative bulk supply arrangements. One whose cattle operations have shown remarkable growth using modern breeding programs. One whose produce and preserved goods are already attracting attention in larger markets." Charles blinked, genuine surprise crossing his features. "You've been busy." "I learned from you, Charles. About business, about leverage, about seeing opportunities." She smiled, feeling James's quiet pride radiating behind her. "I just learned to apply those lessons to something real, something worth building." "The offer stands for 24 hours, Charles said. But Catherine heard the first note of uncertainty in his voice. She lifted the deed, holding it out to James. "This belongs to you, to your family's legacy. The choice is yours." James took the deed, his weathered hands gentle with its age-worn pages. He studied it for a long moment, then looked up at Charles. "Mr. Montgomery," he said carefully, "I appreciate your offer, but some things aren't for sale." Charles's jaw tightened. "You're both fools, choosing dirt and cattle over real opportunity." "No," Catherine said softly. "We're choosing love over leverage, truth over appearance, a future we build together over one bought with manipulation." She took James's arm, feeling the strength in him. "The railroad will come or it won't. Silver Creek will adapt as it always has. But this land, this life we're making, it's not for sale at any price." The banker stared at them for a long moment, his calculated facade cracking just enough to show genuine incomprehension. Then he gathered his papers and money with precise movements. "Good day, Reverend. Catherine." He paused at the door. "I trust you understand this ends any possibility of reconciliation." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "That ended the night. You chose public humiliation over honest words, Charles. I just didn't know it then." After he left, Reverend Matthews cleared his throat. "That was quite something, Mrs. Montgomery. Mr. Cooper." He fingered his collar nervously. Perhaps I was hasty in my judgment of your situation." Catherine smiled, her hand finding James's. God works in mysterious ways, Reverend. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what truly matters. The deed rode home, tucked safely in James's coat, close to his heart. That evening, they added it to the strong box that held his mother's Bible and Catherine's preserved wild flowers, precious things, beyond price, growing more valuable with each passing season. The general store's bell chimed as Catherine entered, her boots leaving muddy prints on the previously clean floor. Mrs. Thompson, arranging yard goods by the window, turned with a look that shifted from disapproval to something softer when she saw who it was. "Catherine," she said, setting down, her bolts of calico. "I heard about Mr. Montgomery's visit yesterday. The whole town's talking." "I'm sure they are." Catherine smiled, the expression genuine despite her weariness. "I hope they're also talking about that bulk supply arrangement you and Sarah Wilson implemented. The savings must be significant." Mrs. Thompson's face brightened. 20%. On feed alone. And Sarah's suggesting we coordinate our preserved goods for the spring market. She paused, studying Catherine. "You've changed things here, you know, not just at the Double C." The store's door chimed again. Charles stood in the entrance, his elegant figure incongruous among the barrels of dry goods and hanging lanterns. "Catherine," he said, as though their meeting was planned, "I've come to make one final appeal to reason." Catherine felt the room grow still. Mrs. Thompson moved closer, her presence offering silent support. Other customers, Mrs. Wilson arranging purchase of seeds, old Mr. Parker getting his tobacco, turned to watch. "Your definition of reason," Catherine said clearly, "has always been whatever serves your interests, Charles." He stepped forward, pulling a small velvet box from his coat. "I'm prepared to be generous. To forget your indiscretions. We could return to Boston, restore your position in society." He opened the box, revealing a diamond ring that caught the store's light like frozen fire. "A fresh start, my dear. Isn't that what you wanted?" Catherine looked at the ring, remembering how once such things had seemed important. How she had measured her worth in carats and social connections, in the envious whispers of other society wives. "No, Charles," she said softly. "That's never what I wanted. I just didn't know it then." The store's door opened once more, and James entered. He carried a small wooden box Catherine recognized, his mother's jewelry case. His eyes took in the scene, but he made no move to interrupt. Charles noticed him too. "Mr. Cooper," he said coldly, "come to witness my wife's return to civilization." "Come to buy nails," James replied mildly. "But please, continue. Seems Catherine's handling things just fine." Catherine felt warmth bloom in her chest at his quiet confidence in her. "I'm not your wife, Charles. You made that very clear at our anniversary party. But more importantly, I'm not your property, not a business asset you can reclaim when its value increases. You're choosing this?" Charles gestured dismissively at the store, at Silver Creek, at everything Catherine had come to love. Dust and poverty and crude frontier living. "I'm choosing happiness," she corrected. "I'm choosing work that matters, people who value more than just appearances, love that's built on respect instead of arrangement." She stepped closer to him, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm choosing to be Catherine, not Mrs. Montgomery, and I think, if you're honest with yourself, you never wanted a wife at all. You wanted an ornament, a social asset. I can't be that anymore. I don't want to be." Charles's facade cracked, showing real emotion for the first time. Not love or loss, but bewilderment. "You've lost your mind," he said. But the words lacked conviction. "No," James said quietly, moving to Catherine's side. "She's found herself." He opened his mother's jewelry box, removing a simple gold band, worn smooth with years of love and work. "Been carrying this a while," he said to Catherine, "waiting for the right moment. Figure there won't be a better one for asking if you'd consider being Mrs. Cooper instead." The store fell absolutely silent. Catherine looked at the two rings before her, Charles's diamond, cold and brilliant and demanding, and the simple band that had graced James's mother's hand through decades of ranch life. "James Cooper," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you proposing to me in the general store, in front of my former husband and half the town?" His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Seems I am, unless you'd rather I didn't," Catherine laughed, the sound pure and free as prairie wind. "I'd rather you did exactly what you're doing." She held out her hand. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The simple band slid onto her finger, warm as sunshine. It fit as though it had been waiting for her all along. Charles closed his velvet box with a sharp snap. "You'll regret this," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "No," Catherine said, looking at her hand in James's. "I won't, but I do hope you find happiness, Charles. The real kind, not the sort that can be bought or sold." He left without another word. In the silence that followed, Mrs. Thompson was the first to move, pulling Catherine into an unexpected embrace. "Welcome to Silver Creek," she said, properly this time. One by one, the townspeople came forward. Handshakes for James, hugs for Catherine, words of congratulation and acceptance. The simple gold band caught the light as Catherine moved among them, not with the flash of diamonds, but with the warm glow of promises kept and love freely given. Catherine sat at the kitchen table, early morning light streaming through the windows as she addressed the last of the wedding invitations. Her handwriting had changed over the months, she noticed, less ornate than her Boston script, but more honest somehow. Each invitation was simple, written on plain paper in straightforward words. "You are warmly invited to celebrate the marriage of Catherine Winters and James Cooper at the Double C Ranch, Saturday, April 15th, at sunset. The barn doors will be open. For dancing, please bring a dish to share." Looking at the stack of completed invitations, Catherine smiled at how different they were from the elaborate engraved cards that had announced her first wedding. These were written by her own hand, the ink slightly smudged in places from honest work interrupted to pen them. "Those the last of them?" James asked, coming in from his morning chores. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, familiar and sweet. "Just finished Thompson's and Wilson's." She held up the final invitation. "Sarah's bringing her famous apple pies, and Mrs. Thompson's promised her winter preserves for the reception." James settled into his chair, pouring coffee for them both. "Whole town's treating it like their own celebration. Old Parker's been curing a ham since we announced the date." "It is their celebration in a way." Catherine took a sip of coffee, savoring its warmth. "They're as much a part of our story as the ranch itself." The weeks leading up to the wedding transformed the Double C. Women arrived daily with offers of help, their previous judgment forgotten in the joy of preparation. The barn was swept and decorated with early spring wildflowers. Quilts were aired, recipes exchanged and stories shared as Catherine found herself embraced by the community that had once shunned her. Mrs. Wilson arrived one afternoon with a package wrapped in brown paper. "My wedding dress," she said, eyes misty with memory. "Thought you might like to wear it if you've a mind to. It's simple, but..." Catherine unfolded the garment carefully. The white cotton was softened with age, but still beautiful, its clean lines and honest simplicity exactly right for a ranch wedding. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching the hand-worked lace at the collar. "You'll need something borrowed anyway," Mrs. Wilson said, wiping her eyes. "And something old." "Something new would be these," Mrs. Thompson added, producing a pair of practical but pretty boots. "From all of us in town. Can't have you walking down the aisle in your work boots." The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright. The prairie, dressed in its spring finest, wildflowers dotted the grass, and the air was soft with promise. Catherine stood in her loft one last time, looking out over the ranch that had become her true home. The ceremony itself was everything her first wedding had not been. No elaborate church service, no society photographers, no calculated displays of wealth. Instead, under the open sky with the double seas pastures stretching to the horizon, Reverend Matthews spoke of love and partnership, of two lives joining as naturally as two streams flowing together. "The ring you wear," he said, nodding to Catherine's simple gold band, "has seen 40 years of ranch life, 40 years of hard work, joy, sorrow, and unwavering love. May it see 40 more on your hand, carrying forward that legacy of devotion." James's voice was rough with emotion as he repeated his vows. Catherine's was clear and strong, her words carrying across the gathered crowd with the certainty of absolute truth. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers from their neighbors nearly drowned out the meadowlarks singing in the grass. The celebration that followed filled the barn with music, laughter, and the rich scents of home cooking. Lanterns cast a warm glow over tables laden with community offerings, pies and preserves, roasted meats and fresh bread, each dish made with care and congratulation. "Look at them," Mrs. Tate said to no one in particular, watching James and Catherine's first dance. "If that ain't real love, I never saw it." As the fiddles played and couples twirled across the barn floor, Catherine caught glimpses of her posted invitations tucked into vest pockets and apron folds, kept as mementos. She realized of a day the whole town had claimed as their own. Later, in a quiet moment between dances, James led her outside. The spring evening was settling over the ranch, painting the world in shades of purple and gold. From the barn came the sounds of celebration, but here, under the first stars, they found a moment of peace. "Happy, Mrs. Cooper?" James asked softly. Catherine touched the simple ring on her finger, thinking of all the paths that had led her here. "Happier than I ever knew was possible," she answered, and kissed him under the vast prairie sky. Inside the barn, their wedding invitation lay on display among the gifts and flowers, its simple words testament to the truth that love, like happiness, often comes dressed in plain clothes, carrying the warmth of home in its honest heart. On their first wedding anniversary, Catherine stood in the ranch house parlor, adjusting the new family portrait in its simple wooden frame. The photographer from Silver City had captured them just as they were. James in his good shirt but still unmistakably a rancher. Catherine in a practical dress with her hair swept back, both of them sun-browned and smiling. Behind them, to the Double C's main house stood proud, its fresh paint and new curtains evidence of a year's shared prosperity. "Came out nice," James said, coming up behind her and sliding his arms around her waist. "Though he didn't capture how your eyes light. Up when you're negotiating cattle prices." Catherine laughed, leaning back against him. "Or how you look when you're teaching the Thompson boys about ranch work." Their neighbors' sons had become regular visitors, eager to learn from James's patient instruction. The past year had brought changes to more than just their lives. The railroad had indeed come to Silver Creek, though not through any influence of Charles's. Catherine's careful market research and business proposals, combined with the town's growing reputation for quality, cattle and produce, had caught the Railroad Commission's attention on their own merit. The Double C had flourished under their joint stewardship. Catherine's business acumen and James's ranching expertise had proven a powerful combination. Their bulk supply arrangement with neighboring ranches had expanded to include 6 more properties. The preserved goods operation, started with Mrs. Thompson and Sarah Wilson, now supplied stores as far away as Denver. "Been thinking," James said, still holding her close, "about adding on to the house. A proper office for you, maybe a nursery." Catherine turned in his arms, her heart skipping at his words. "A nursery?" His eyes were soft as he touched her cheek. "Noticed you've been a bit queasy in the mornings lately. Reminded me of how my mother was, early on with my sister. I was going to tell you tonight," Catherine whispered. "I wanted to be sure first." James's smile was brighter than summer sunrise. "How long have you known?" "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. He thinks early December." She touched the portraits. frame, imagining another face joining theirs next year. Your mother's Bible has a page for recording births. I looked at it last night, saw where she'd written about you and your sister. We'll add our own entries now. James's voice was rough with emotion. Start our own family stories. Catherine thought of the journey that had brought her here, from Boston's gilded parlors to this sun-warmed ranch house, from arranged marriage to real partnership, from empty wealth to true abundance. I never thought I'd have this, she admitted. Real love, a true home, a child on the way. A whole town of friends, James added, nodding toward the window where they could see Thompson's wagon approaching. Sarah mentioned they're coming by with an anniversary supper. Indeed, the afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors. The Wilsons arrived with fresh-baked bread, the Thompsons with early summer vegetables. Even Mrs. Tate came, bringing her famous berry preserves and a shy congratulation when she noticed Catherine's telltale glow. As the sun set, their friends gathered on the porch, sharing food and stories. Catherine sat in the old rocker that had been James's mother's, his hand resting warm on her shoulder. The family portrait watched over them from its place of honor, testament to how far they'd come. You know, Mrs. Thompson said, helping herself to more bread, I saved one of your wedding invitations, got it pressed in my Bible next to my own. Speaking of invitations, Sarah Wilson added with a knowing smile, might be time to start thinking about some birth announcements. The news spread through the gathering like warm honey, bringing fresh congratulations and joyful tears. Catherine accepted their embraces, marveling at how these people had become her true family. Later, after their friends had gone home and the prairie night had wrapped the ranch in star-studded darkness, Catherine and James stood together, looking at the portrait. It caught not just their images, but the contentment in their eyes, the strength of their partnership, the hope for their future. Happy? James asked, echoing his question from their wedding day. Catherine touched the simple gold band on her finger, then laid her other hand gently over her middle, where their child grew. Beyond measure, she answered. This is what real happiness feels like, built day by day, earned through honest work, shared with people you love. The portrait caught the lamplight, reflecting back the image of a couple who had found in each other not just love, but purpose. Not just partnership, but completion. The double C had given Catherine refuge when she'd had nothing. Now it gave her everything: home, family, and a future rich with promise. Outside, a meadowlark sang its evening song, and the prairie wind carried the scent of wild roses blooming against weathered fence posts, telling stories of love that grew stronger with each passing season.